Good afternoon. Always dangerous to have a big lunch and then sit down after a morning in the sun to have a serious conversation. But we are so excited to have you all here. And this is a new thing we have not always done at the Carter Project, but we wanted to bring in friends. This is a powerhouse group, and we want to have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to invite you into the conversation as well. We have a wealth of housing knowledge and private sector experience, construction experience across the room, and we have an incredibly distinguished panel today to talk about housing. We have a couple of goals. We're going to talk about, first, how did it get this bad, and what are some big ideas for increasing the housing supply, and what might it take? And then we're going to talk about partnership, and the power of partnership, and how do we use partnerships, which in some ways are the only way we're going to tackle something as complex as housing. And so we are thrilled to be with you all. It is, you've seen a wonderful example. Habitat has always built, and we will always build. In many ways, the building is a demonstration of what is possible, but we know that we can't build our way out of the challenge. I think about 15 years ago, we sat down, and Habitat was growing pretty fast, and we calculated how long would it take for Habitat to achieve its vision of everyone in the world having safe, decent, affordable housing. And if we compounded our growth rate, if Habitat wanted to do it by itself, I think the answer was something like 1,032 years, which felt really slow. And so that was unacceptable. So we moved to the language of we want to be a partner and catalyst for worldwide access to safe, decent, affordable housing. And that really forced us into thinking about housing ecosystems and systems. How do we impact the whole housing value chain in a way that lowers barriers to allow people to be able to improve their own housing? And so we want to build and we want to influence. That started a significant amount of work in policy and advocacy, because in many ways, governments control land use and zoning, and land is at the heart of all housing. And so it had always been a core principle, but not necessarily a practice for us to advocate. And we launched full out. We are in the midst now of our first ever U.S. advocacy campaign. We did a global advocacy campaign called Solid Ground. It was all about property rights, especially for women and marginalized groups around the world who didn't have the right to own their land, even if they had lived there for generations. We're in the fourth year of our first ever U.S. advocacy campaign called Cost of Home. And it's really all about affordability, because we have an affordability crisis in this country. And as we go into the fifth year, Habitat has been we've contributed to more than 300 successful policy changes and unlocked almost $22 billion of government funds for home affordability, allowing an estimated 6.6 million people to be enabled or increased access to safe, decent, affordable housing. Progress, those are very good things, but we also recognize that is just scratching the surface of what's needed. So we have a number of our cabinet members here today, and I'm so grateful for your leadership and expertise and voices. And I want to introduce our wonderful panel. So we have in alphabetical order, but not in direct order. Steve Boland is the Chief Administrative Officer of Bank of America. They are a longtime partner and supporter of Habitat and supporter of the Carter Work Project. Steve, we're so glad to have you here. I think in your materials we gave you all bios, so I am not going to take the whole panel to read through, because it would take half our time to read all of their incredible accomplishments. Mary Mack is the sort of retired CEO of the Consumer and Small Business Banking for Wells Fargo, and also serves on Habitat's International Board of Directors. I think this is just an example of Habitat. We talked about bringing people together. Here we have two banks that are fairly fierce competitors.
And they even dress alike.
And they even...
I didn't get the memo.
I put on real pants for the first time in a week. They're clean. And then I realized if I had my Carolina clay shoes, you would know that I didn't really dress up for it. So, sorry.
It's a good thing. We are glad you're here. Sean Donovan, a great friend of housing and friend of Habitat, is the newly minted CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, a major housing finance and community development organization. Sean, former HUD secretary and head of OMB, so he has run some things with some complexity, and we do a lot with Enterprise and are excited to do a lot more. And Tony Pickett, another great friend, is the CEO of the Grounded Solutions Network, which is focused on lasting affordability and finding ways to create long-term affordability through land trusts and other shared equity, other mechanisms. And hopefully when we get to solutions, we will talk a little bit about that. I'm going to ask them some questions, and then you can think of your questions. We're going to save some time for all of you. So let's jump in. Tony and Sean, let's talk about how you're both housing coaches. Sean, would you start and just give the overview picture of the housing landscape from your perspective? How did it get this bad, maybe to get everybody on the same page?
So first of all, Jonathan, it is wonderful to be here. One of the highlights of my work in housing over the last 30 years was to actually hammer nails side by side with Jimmy Carter in the South Bronx and a bunch of other places. Got to know he and Rosalynn pretty well. So it's enormously meaningful to be here with all of you, and I couldn't be a bigger fan of Habitat. So great to be here. To date myself, I started working in housing 3 decades ago, volunteered in a homeless shelter. I was a student working at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Chris Herbert was one of my colleagues. He's now running the Joint. And literally, I've never seen it this bad. And I would say we've had a chronic affordability crisis in this country. It's been getting worse over decades, but it has become acute over the last few years in a way that I've never seen. And just to put a finer point on it, we literally, nationally, had the biggest rent increases year over year, about 18%, that we've ever seen since we started keeping the records, right? But I think more profoundly what's happened is, look, I'm a New Yorker. Housing is expensive. Everybody's like, yeah, it's always been expensive in New York. The truth is now, everywhere you go around this country, you see housing affordability. Boise, Idaho, where rents have quadrupled, and a huge number of places, rural, urban. And that's where I think it really is different. The other thing I would say for this audience is this is a moral and social imperative. It is increasingly an economic imperative for this country in a way that is different. And it used to be that one of the hallmarks of the American economy is our people move to where the jobs are. We have been the most mobile people on earth, largely because we have a housing system that allows that, and we're adventurous people. But if you look today at a low-income family living in the Delta or living in an area where there aren't growth in jobs, you can go get a much higher paying job somewhere else. It does not make sense to move because of the costs of housing and other affordability challenges. And so literally, there are a lot more and more studies showing that the GDP of this country is growing trillions of dollars slower because we cannot access the workers that we need to make our economy grow in the way that we should. And so I think it's not just the geographic spread of this issue, but it's the fact that it's affecting almost every aspect of American life and the American economy in ways that, for me, are different. And that, we obviously have spent a lot of time on the moral side of this, talking to homeowners today. It's incredibly moving to understand the power that housing can make, the difference it can make in people's lives. It touches everything: education, health, access to jobs. We all know that, but I think this is a different level of crisis than I've ever seen.
Thank you, Sean. It is, we got everybody's attention now. It is, I say, which is not actually funny, but I found more and more, we've had a housing crisis for a long time. It has gotten much worse. It's as if people have just discovered it, because I sometimes think middle-class families' kids suddenly can't afford housing, so they have discovered we have a housing crisis. It's actually just the tip of what has been a long and slow-growing one. Tony, coming to you, you build specifically, we advocate for the whole range of housing, but Habitat's particularly niche in production is home ownership, and something you all saw some examples today. But can you talk about what's going on and the importance, both the challenges and the importance of home ownership in today's markets?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say, similar to Sean, it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to serve on the Cost of Home Cabinet. One thing I want to communicate to everybody is Although Habitat and Grounded Solutions are separate organizations, our origins lie in the same place with the same intent. People in Southwest Georgia who really believed that everyone deserved a decent place to live. That's the crux of it. And it's not about how hard you've worked. It's not about whether you deserve a place to live. It's you're entitled just for living to have a decent home. And I'll just say, for me, home and its importance and the focus on home ownership, to piggyback on Sean a little bit, I usually, when I'm giving a presentation, I show this slide. It has a graph on it. If you look at average household income, and you start in 1960, and you come to the present, it's a relatively flat line. It increases slightly, but not dramatically. If you look at average rents and the average price to purchase a home, those increase dramatically. We've been relying on the private market to solve for the differential between those things. We've reached a point where it's no longer possible to just believe that private market dynamics are going to solve that. We have to intervene. And that's part of why I'm leading Grounded Solutions Network and partnering with Habitat, and a number of our network members, over 260 of them today, but a number of them are Habitat affiliates who are using our approach to preserving affordability as long as possible. We like to say permanent whenever possible. That means any effort, any subsidies, any resources that are invested in creating affordable homeownership stays affordable. Even if the house sells to a subsequent family, that next family is able to achieve it at an affordable price. The selling family, our numbers say, have acquired enough equity in the shared equity arrangement that we use to go on to purchase a traditional market rate home. So they are making the transition to full market rate home ownership without some of the risk that a first-time home buyer has to face, because our organizations are there to back them throughout that learning process in the first years of home ownership. But I think we also have to understand having a home is the essential foundation to every other success that we expect a family to achieve. Successfully raising children, having a successful educational experience, being able to train yourself for a new position to get a better paying job. If you don't have a stable home, how do you divide your attention between finding a place to live that you can afford and getting trained for the next opportunity? So I would just say we have to understand that that's fundamental, and that's the need that a majority of folks in our society are going to have, and we have to plan for that. We have not done a successful job of planning. I think the other side of it, and I think we're going to get into that later in the panel, is we know that there have been systemic barriers to people of color in particularly achieving ownership of land and homes. And so we've got to counter what we have created in the current system and not just expect that folks are going to be able to fit themselves into the current system and be successful. Things like, and I'll talk about it later on, remind me, special purpose credit programs, having a particular focus on Black and brown home ownership. We know that gap exists. Chris Herbert's done a number of studies that prove it. So having that evidence means we have to craft a solution that actually meets the magnitude of the challenge.
Thank you, Tony. We are going to circle back to that. It's really important. For those of you who don't know, there's about a 30-point gap between Black and white home ownership in the country. So over 70% of white families do have own their homes, and low 30s of Black families, and that's a huge gap. And anyway, families are, if you're not in, it's now become so hard to get in. There's so little supply of entry-level housing, and people are paying so much in rent that it's almost impossible to save the down payment or have the room to get in. So it's challenging. Let's switch sides to the private sector, because as much as we need a huge amount of government financing and zoning and all the different roles the government plays, there is not enough government funding to build our way out of the solution. We need a ton of private sector. And turns out there are a couple of really large banks on this panel. Mary, can you, let's start with you, talking about the role of the private sector as we try to figure out how to do this and where you see innovative financing and strategic opportunities to start making a dent.
Sure, and I would also say and echo, thank you for those of you all who've traveled here to see it. There's no better place to put the mission of Habitat on display than at a Carter Build. And for those of you all who live here and came out and spent the day checking it out, thank you for doing that too. Because if we've raised awareness around Habitat as a solution provider, it's been a good day. So we appreciate your doing that. You know, we, believe it or not, even as a bank, we think probably as much about the housing affordability issue as we do the supply side of it. And for us, it's been through really targeted, and we've been on a journey to create much more targeted philanthropic solutions that aren't just to, you know, support our communities, although we want to do that, but to be really intentional about, for us, it's 4 pillars: housing affordability, small business creation, which is also about wealth building, and how to help specifically diverse small businesses, financial health, which is obviously a component of the Habitat model, but really cuts across all of our customers, and climate, which is increasingly a shared issue on all these same topics. And specifically around housing affordability, for us, it's probably $300 million a year just into some of those wealth building and affordability segments. But it's also about innovation. You know, if we had a solution, we wouldn't have a panel. And it's about our finding capital that can be, because, you know, for those of you all who travel in those circles, sometimes bank capital is a little hard to access for new ideas that we don't know if they're going to work or not. So we're funding things like reuse accelerators. So how do we reuse malls and hospital buildings and other things that could become solutions in the space, or other innovation hub solutions around housing affordability, so that we can fund others either individually or through a network and provide very patient and forgiving capital that can be used to explore some of those. And we do all of that through the foundation, because it gives those of you all who are experimenting with those solutions the flexibility to do it.
And just to double down on that, we partner with Wells on a housing affordability challenge. We were just talking about your entry in that challenge. So Wells is making a big difference on this front.
Thank you, Mary. Steve, building on that, the bank has been deeply involved in many partnerships, but where some bright spots as you look at the banks, both the business side and the philanthropic side, where have you seen partnerships working to actually start to address the problems?
Yeah, look, we think partnerships are critical. Mary talked about it. It takes a lot of capital, and you've got to bring a lot of capital to bear. So you think about partnerships, community development financial institutions, critical component to us. So we're the largest funder of community development financial institutions. CDFIs, I think our portfolio is $2 billion. We've partnered with Enterprise and with LISC, and in fact, I think we've committed. Enterprise has you talked about middle-class families. Enterprise has a middle-income family fund that we've committed $150 million to support that. We've partnered with organizations like the Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America. They've got working with us, we created a no down payment program with no MI. We pay all non-recurring closing costs, no minimum credit score. We've been in partners with them for some 30 years, I think. And, so they've helped, I want to say it's somewhere around 45,000 or so families. And so it's all of these partnerships that, there's not one silver bullet. We're looking to partner across minority deposit institutions. They play a critical role. So how do you enable them to get more credit, small business as well as lending out there? And so we doubled our level of deposits at more MDIs from 100 million to 200 million. There are a lot of levers that you need to pull. The partnerships in the community are critical. Even the work we're doing with just HUD-approved counselors. And we've got 350 HUD-approved counselors that we work with around the country, because part of this is just education to prepare for homeownership opportunities that are critically important.
Could I just add one thing that you might not believe is we partner with each other too, because in these communities, we've got shared needs in areas like workforce development, in fundamental education issues. And so it's become, I think, increasingly common for us to come together and say, we're all healthier if we're focused on the health of the community. And that's been accelerated in a market like Charlotte in particular.
I think it's so important. Actually, and Charlotte, we gave an example earlier of we're here because this historically affordable market has become unaffordable. There's also a good example of a healthy system in Charlotte where the private sector works with the city, works with nonprofit groups. And I think that model is critically important as well as we try to reverse that. Let's talk about how do we fix this? Because we need a huge amount of supply. And from both a policy perspective and practical solutions, we've talked about it's going to take everybody, and we can jump in, but maybe back for Sean and Tony, give us some examples, give some hope to the audience, give some examples of things that have the promise to scale up that could make things better.
Well, speaking of hope, my old boss, Barack Obama, used to say that a crisis is a terrible thing, but it's also a terrible thing to waste. And so I think the question we should all be asking ourselves is, at this moment when the affordability crisis is literally worse than it's ever been, what can we all do to come together? This is an audience that bridges private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, geographically, and political parties as well. This is a moment where I think we have to ask ourselves, are we really committed as a country to moving the needle on this? And let's just think about when we as a country come together, every child in this country is guaranteed a public education. We now have a system that allows everyone to access health care. We have a system that if you can't afford food, you can get benefits to do that. 1 in 5 people that qualifies for housing assistance gets it. Think about that. 4 out of 5 are stuck out in the cold. And so the question is, are we as a country really going to live up to our values around housing? And I do think this is a moment where we can be dreaming and asking for more to try to move a movement forward on housing. We got to be very clear that there are lots of folks in this country who say they're for more affordable housing, but if it's going to be next door to them, they're not so supportive, right? And so we are starting to see in Republican and Democratic states, in localities around the country, folks starting to ask hard questions about whether individual communities should be able to shut out low-income folks. And not even low-income folks, like a teacher can teach your kid, a nurse can save your kid's life, but they can't be your neighbor. Is that right in this country? And so we're starting to see movements that say, you know what? If you're near a transit stop, if you're in a place close to the central business district, we're going to say you have to be willing to allow more dense housing and solutions. And so on a supply side. And then the other thing I would say, talking about public-private partnerships, the low-income housing tax credit, I would argue, is the most successful public-private partnership we've ever had in housing. Bank of America, huge investor with us in those. And that also is not freely available, right? We set a limit on those low-income housing tax credits that we don't apply to the homeownership tax credit, which doesn't work so well, as I said. And so there's a huge opportunity, I think, if we can build the will and the movement, that we have solutions that could scale and work. The question is, are we going to live up to that?
Thank you, Sean. Just put a little more color. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act is actually a priority for Habitat and many of our partners. This would be to explain just a little bit more. There are communities, as much as right here we have a problem that there's nothing affordable, in places like Detroit, New Orleans, parts of major urban cities, there's still whole parts of the city that are historically underinvested. In those areas, you can buy a house for a very low cost, but largely if you then put the money in to rehab it and bring it up to code, it won't appraise for for what you've invested in both buying it and rehabbing it. This would be a federal tax credit that would actually help solve the math gap between the appraisal and what it costs to do it, and allow us to preserve significant amounts of housing relatively quickly. Bipartisan support, not enough bipartisan support yet, clearly, and we want to work on that.
Jonathan, that would be huge, though. So I will tell you, because admittedly, I think we have tried and failed. I'm looking at Andrew because in my old job when I ran the retail bank, we've tried and failed on these programs, and that's what we need. Is we need help with that gap. We absolutely need help with that gap, because that's where those programs really haven't scaled.
And I have actually, interestingly enough, in the audience, another friend of ours has figured out a way to use Section 8 vouchers to make this math work in Detroit. I want to unpack that and figure it out. But of course, there still aren't enough vouchers to your exact point. Tony, coming back to you, the math is sort of structurally broken now, and many of you are in one part or another around the housing, but Charlotte actually used to be the example of a place where you could afford, a good-hearted developer could build apartments that were very affordable for most of the population, and we held that up as an example. That's not the case. That is nationally not the case now. And then home ownership has become further out of reach for so many. Tony, can you just talk a little bit about, go a little deeper on some of your solutions? Yep. And explain what shared equity might look like, or why a land trust adds value, because I do think this is an important part of fixing the math, because land is such a part of why housing has gone up so fast.
Yeah, but before I do that, I want to be sure to kind of say, I want to give HUD a little credit. In the current administration under Secretary Fudge, they have agreed to actually reopen and re-examine the HOME program. How many of you in the audience know about the HOME program, capital HOME? That is one of the largest subsidy programs that is supporting affordable home ownership. Our members, Habitat affiliates, CDCs, any affordable housing organization that's working on home ownership likely is receiving some support from the HOME program. Not only do we have to advocate for it to be funded at the right level, at the federal level, but the actual regulations and guidance around the HOME program, we've known for some time, cause a great deal of interpretation at the local level. That's not good. We cannot consistently access the HOME program because of the variations across the various interpretations by local HUD officials. So they're going to reopen that process, refine the guidance, simplify it, hopefully, so that all of us will have an easier time accessing that subsidy. And to your question, we're not going to solve the gap in affordability unless we subsidize it. And so having an effective subsidy source and enough of it is part of the solution to fix it. And we need bipartisan support to accomplish that. And I would say Habitat, Grounded Solutions, Enterprise, a number of other partners, we're there inside the Beltway in DC. For the first time, we've formed a homeownership coalition to really focus and coordinate our advocacy so that we can talk with one voice and be able to corral that kind of bipartisan support that we need in order to be successful. It won't be a short-term thing. We recognize that. It's a long-term play. We're investing time and effort in doing that. And I think that's a thing we can hold on to for hope in the future. The other thing that I want to be sure and emphasize is I'm picking up across the conversation of this panel, partnership. That's a key essential ingredient in this. We have to be willing to partner, and we have to find unusual sometimes partners. One thing I can lift up is Amazon. A couple of years ago, they launched their $2 billion housing equity fund. That's the kind of resource that needs to be brought to bear at that level. It's not all focused on home ownership. It's been doing a lot of multifamily rental, but I will say your question about there's a housing continuum. Successful homeowners don't just materialize out of thin air. They have to be successful renters. So got to stabilize them on the rental side. Once that happens and they're ready to make the transition to homeownership, I'm happy to tell you that Amazon has committed some of that $2 billion fund to affordable homeownership, and one of the focus areas of that is the Seattle region, and the local Habitat affiliate there is a partner along with us and the National Housing Trust, which is a CDFI, to really ramp up production of homes with lasting affordability using our shared equity approach. And what we're doing is simply saying, we're going to subsidize your entry into homeownership if you're a low, moderate income family. And specifically, we're hoping that we're going to benefit Black and brown families to solve for the homeownership gap. But if you decide to sell at some point in the future, you're only going to be able to take a limited amount of the upside equity that accrues. That value of the home is going to escalate over time. So if we subsidized it, it's not fair for you to walk away with all of it. We're going to give you a decent share of it. We're going to retain the majority of it to make that same home affordable for another low, moderate income family in the future. That's the, I would say, sustainable way to achieve affordability. Sean, you talk about the low-income housing tax credit. My only challenge to us all is to figure out, how do we extend the affordability requirement beyond 15, 30 years?
Forever.
Yes, that's right. We need that. That is the missing piece in all of this. If we're investing the effort and resources to create affordability, it shouldn't be lost and converted to market, and then we have to pay an even higher price to recreate that in the future.
And we are sadly losing more units than we're building right now, so as they expire. A couple of things I want to catch. One thing, this is where on the builder side, we are very aligned in the private sector. One way we can actually make it more affordable is to make it easier and faster to build. And I think there are well-intended local governments and cases, and sometimes even with our dear friends at HUD, where it is so complicated that that's a tax. You know, if it takes longer and is slower, that is an opportunity side as well. And I do think this is a tension, right? There's a really good thing if we can build equity for a family, and it's a really good thing if we help a lot of families. And I think Habitat is having to react where historically that subsidy between what the family could afford and the cost of the home was relatively modest. We would have a soft second mortgage that got forgiven over time or only captured if the family sold it. Now you're talking about sometimes really large subsidies, or if a city's going to give land, as they did in this case for the wonderful neighborhood we're building, it's quite reasonable for the city to want to have long-term affordability in that market. And in Seattle, you know, you're talking about multi-$100,000 lots, and so it actually makes a lot of sense. So it becomes an entry point, but it's a trade-off between building wealth for the family, a very good thing, and helping a lot more families. Otherwise, our founder called it the lottery for humanity. If then a few families hit the lottery, but we're not actually helping enough families when we need to do this at scale. Tying to that, because wealth creation does matter, coming back, Mary and Steve, both of you have been deeply involved in addressing this home ownership gap. And I think in the last few years, there's been a really important national conversation about that. Can you speak a little more about how home ownership has been such a key part of this wealth gap in our country?
Well, it is, and you saw it, and you see it too in programs that come out that don't anticipate how even new programs, think about the programs that came out in COVID to help small business owners that were impacted. And the first round of those didn't help some of the youngest, most immature businesses because they had historically not been able to access home ownership the way others had, which is where you get the equity to start your business in the first place. So it doesn't start at the home ownership point. It sometimes starts way ahead of that. And for us, it's also been about thinking about innovative products and solutions to solve different problems that people face when they step up to that door, so to speak, is whether it is in covering the cost of our cost, for instance, in closing, and upfront dollars that go in to fund those upfront costs that surprise a lot of our new homeowners when they are heading down that road, or subsidies that allow for the buy downs, 3% mortgages done responsibly, or 3% down payment mortgages done responsibly. We can think about the affordability of home. So it is, there are a number of those different solutions that we've put in place to enable, but it does have to start way ahead of that. It's financial health. It's partnering, it's focusing on the unbanked. There are millions of unbanked in America, most of whom are Black, African American, Hispanic, or Native. And they don't have access to credit. They don't have access to building credit. They have cultural perspectives that have not led to a long-term trust of the banking system in some cases when you go into some of our Native communities, for instance. So we've got to think about it differently than the way we've historically determined solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting as we talk through it because there are so many things that we are working after, and it is really where we're partnering because this isn't something we need to compete over. We need more to the pie, right? And so, I was thinking about the other initiative with Enterprise that we've got. It's a Black Indigenous People of Color fund. I think we've committed $60 million to that. This is for diverse developers, right? And so investing there as well. Our community development banking group focuses on affordable multifamily housing, and we talked about this escalating rents issue. We've got to figure out a solution there, and so we've got folks that are working in that space as well. And Mary touched on this earlier because it is an area that we partner heavily around, which is around this area of jobs and workforce development, because it's really, really important. We have a Pathways program. There are other educational programs that lead to work-ready jobs. And we can tie that with Habitat homeowners and applicants and making sure that we're connecting them to those programs. And I do think this issue of the gap around down payment and closing costs, we have a program called a community homeownership commitment, and we fund down payment and closing cost grants up to $17,500 per homeowner. I'm not sure it's enough. It's what we're doing, but it's not. I'm not sure it's enough. We could continue to keep pushing, but I think we've done over $400 million just in grants. The program is a $15 billion, kind of lending program, and trying to create 60,000 homeowners. We've got over 40,000 through that. These are drops in the bucket, and it's interesting because I think both our institutions talk in billions, and they sound like big numbers until you really understand the magnitude of the problem, and you realize we're really just kind of scratching the surface a bit. But it's all these initiatives that we have to continue to get after to close the gap.
Thank you.
Can I just jump on that? Because you mentioned the program we're working together on called Equitable Path Forward. And I just want to give a very specific example of how this works. I was in New Orleans a couple weeks ago, and we were with a fourth generation Black developer who has worked in relatively low income communities across New Orleans over 4 generations, right? And you'd think 4 generations later, they would have the capital to be able to be playing big. And we were visiting far and away the biggest project they'd ever done. But if you compound the inequality on family wealth that is based in primarily our housing system, as you said, compound that with their working in communities of color where the values have always been lower and haven't increased in the same way, you quickly get to a extremely competent developer who cannot access the capital and does not have it in their pocket to be able to advance. And so what we did in this case is we acted as their deep pockets so that when the government agency that gives tax credits demands that you have a certain net worth that you can put up against it, we can provide that to them. When they demand that you have bonding and other requirements, we can do that in ways that begin to level the playing field of multi-generational inequity that we see. And so I think these are really powerful. We have another program called the Renter Wealth Creation Fund, where we've gotten below market capital. We will go in and buy existing affordable housing and say to the renters, if the value of this property increases, we'll share when we refinance or sell, we'll share some of that upside with you, right? So there are structures that you can create very specifically to overcome these historic inequities, but they require mission-oriented capital and real, and to your point, scale, where you can start to get at these problems in a way that isn't just a boutique answer.
Right. And I think also sort of going in a different direction, but similar, I'm going to say what in some conversations are two bad words: inclusionary zoning. If we
Not in this audience.
if we could have a majority of jurisdictions adopt inclusionary zoning, that means in any market rate development of a certain size, a certain percentage of the units produced must be affordable. That eliminates all of this, oh, I'll only put the affordable housing over there because I don't want to be inconvenienced. No, those are your next door neighbors. There's no deciding outside of the process. And so we have seen resistance to that. It's going to take a coalition of the willing to overcome that. And it's a basically jurisdiction by jurisdiction fight. In some states, they've preempted it in state law, so it would have to be a state fight to actually have it implemented. But I am happy to say here in North Carolina, we have a network member in Chapel Hill that actually benefits from an inclusionary zoning policy that produces affordable homeownership units from the private market and transfers those over to the nonprofit program to steward successfully in perpetuity. So there are ways to combine these approaches and not have this sort of like choice to be made between, are we supporting market-based solutions or are we supporting mission-based solutions?
I think the key is how do we, this is where we've really been consumed with, how do we make markets work? And I used to talk about carrots and sticks because we are wildly in favor of inclusionary zoning. If we just do that but don't give anything to the developer when they're already struggling to make a project pencil, then we don't get units. So that's not so good. But we know mixed income is the right answer. And the data is just overwhelmingly clear that children with families of low incomes who grow up in mixed income communities still have relatively strong social mobility. But children growing up in concentrated poverty, and sadly, my hometown of Atlanta and Charlotte are among the worst, even though been historically affordable, for mobility because we've got economic segregation. And so this is a huge piece. And it's funny, Chapel Hill is my actual hometown in North Carolina. And this is like, I tell the story all the time, it's a win and a lose. Our Habitat affiliate there is doing a spectacular 250 unit mixed income, market rate, missing middle Habitat home community. That is the great news. Bad news, most liberal town in the state of North Carolina, and it took 15 years to get the project approved. Think about what that then costs in terms of holding that land, in terms of that's not good. So I used to think carrots and sticks. A friend of mine said it's not carrots and sticks, it's 2x4 and cake. So you need to whack them with a 2x4, but there has to be a lot of cake in there too. It could be density bonuses, making it faster and easier to build, subsidized financing. So we've got to find some cake in there too. Mary, let's make it a little more personal. You have been a long time Habitat volunteer. You all got a tour. You got to meet with some of the families. That is why we do this. I'm going to say this with the greatest respect. We have some great construction workers in this room. The reason we engage millions of volunteers is not actually a construction strategy, though you are all awesome. It is now we know. I shouldn't. We're not supposed to release that secret, but it's a really important social change strategy because ultimately we got to change hearts if we're going to change. Mary, can you just talk about it at a more personal level? Why have you been involved for Habitat for so long, and what has that meant to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that does happen at a Habitat build, though, is magic happens overnight because all those stray nails disappeared when we came back Tuesday morning where we missed the studs. But there literally is nothing like seeing or taking a team to see a Habitat build and participate in it. We've got a couple of houses. We're right across the street from the Bank of America house. And I told this to the North Carolina business, Steve, so I hope they print it. Bank of America finished first. I admitted it. And we had a bigger house, but but they finished it for the day.
You two want to take this outside?
Yeah. They finished for the day, and the Bank of America team came over and climbed the ladders and showed our team how to put in the hurricane support, for instance, and helped us accelerate what we were not going to finish that day in this big house. And that's where some of this partnership starts, is when people get real with people on a build. Or if you have never done it, there is nothing like watching a homeowner see the first wall go up, or seeing her come back the next day and all the walls are up. And then she brought her kids out on day 3 and they walked through their bedrooms. And then she compared paint colors, and you pulled out your phone and showed her your kitchen, which, by the way, the paint colors are very similar to the ones that she selected. I mean, it just puts us all in the same place in a very important way, and it gets people to realize that that's what we're here for, right? And that that this family has changed their life, and you were a very small part of it, not because of your construction skills. And so to see that, or to go, well, okay, so some of you have construction skills, but to see that and to see it become very real, and then you have a conversation on the bus about why was it so hard to do, or gosh, 27 houses, isn't that great? No, we need 32,000 in Charlotte. And 27 is bigger than 20, Laura. Shout out to that, because that was where it started. And we've got a gap of 32,000 in a market like this. So if you can get a bunch of us who then put on suits during the day to go back to work, thinking about that in our day job, you start getting things like accelerators or conversations with, all right, we can't solve all of it, but what part can we play? But it really grabs your heart in a way that's very real. And if we can help people understand that they need to change policy, we need to put dollars. People, we do have some people who leave these bills thinking, well, I hammer it all day. What else do they want? Really, they could have done it a lot faster without us. And so it's team building. We come out as teams. We come out as individuals. Both of them have real benefit. And it brings communities together in a way that you just, I am a part of a lot of nonprofit organizations, and you just don't get it anywhere else the way you get it at Habitat.
And Jonathan, I got to,
longtime partner as well.
just add, it's that volunteerism. The spirit of volunteerism is amazing. We've had a lot of our colleagues out there. I got to call out Brenda Suits in the back, who gets us organized and gets folks here. Our partnership with Habitat in Charlotte goes back almost 40 years. It's now expanded globally. And even Jonathan knows this week we had a senior leadership meeting going on, and so a few leaders have been back and forth trying, supporting. But one of the things that we did is the top 300 senior leaders from around the world were here in Charlotte. Was it yesterday morning, I think? Was that when we did? Yeah, instead of breakfast, that's what we did. Was we were doing a Habitat volunteer activity, and nobody ever shows up for breakfast. They're like, the meeting starts at 8:30. I'll get there, 8:20. Everybody's there at 7:30 saying, no, I want to help put these baskets together. So it really engenders a tremendous spirit, a tremendous sense of camaraderie, and yes, we develop a few skills that we may not quite have had, and so it's really just an extraordinary partnership to have.
Can I tell a personal story on this?
Absolutely.
So I have two sons who are 24 and 21, and both of them build Habitat houses for the summer for probably 5 years. And I will say these boys, they grow up on the streets of Brooklyn. They think of themselves as pretty worldly kids. They've played ping pong with the president and done some pretty amazing things. I remember like it was yesterday, the night they came home from their first Habitat build, and I talked to the family. And it changed their world, right? We all grow up in these bubbles in our own worlds, and we think we know what it's like to put yourself in the shoes of another. But that night, the conversation we had at the dinner table, I'm sorry I'm getting emotional, but as a dad, this is what you want for your kids, right? Is you want to open their hearts and their minds to how other folks live and how big a world it is. And that night was something they will never forget.
Thank you. So I'm going to save our last question for the lightning round. Let's open it up now. Comments, questions from all of you?
Yes, sir. What is the average cost, all this, building analysis?
Yeah, thank you. It is, boy, context is everything. The giant wild card is land. You're from California. California is sadly the epitome of lack of affordability. You've got places where the lot is $750,000, and with mostly good intent, they've made it impossible and slow to build. So we have I think they're 3 million units short in California alone, and so that's a huge challenge. Though now there's a lot of creativity about how to change that. So historically, the hard cost of building a house for us was about $75,000 or $80,000 for a long, long time. That has skyrocketed now. Laura, you told us it's now like $180 just hard cost now. What do you?
All in land and everything for the houses and villas next door would be about $225.
So land is still relatively affordable, which is still positive. The places you would expect, the land is the big delta usually between that drives the cost. But skilled labor's up, land is up, materials are up, basically, and of course financing costs are up. So it's kind of a perfect storm of not making it affordable right now. Thanks for asking.
So the supply chain challenges in the building and construction industry are certainly going to have an impact on affordability. Lots of people saying maybe a couple million units short, 400,000 workers also short to build those houses. How does Habitat manage these?
Yeah, and please everybody jump in. That's a huge issue. I mean, during COVID, that was a disaster. And the problem was you couldn't predict schedules. 1 month there were no trusses, the next month there are no windows, the next month there's no appliances. And so it didn't just mess us up, it messed up building production across the whole cycle. A lot of that is mostly cleaned up, but the problem is the costs have stayed up. But I'd jump in, any of you, if you've got thoughts. It is. So the problem now is it's just the costs have not come down. And so, though availability is better now. And what we're now starting to see is because of high interest rates, we had single family new production has been strong because no one is selling their house. So the traditional buy a small house, live in it for a while, sell it and buy a nicer house. If you have a 3% mortgage, you're frozen. Nobody's selling their house right now because they'd have to replace it with a 7% mortgage. So that's a big dilemma. And the other side is just the math for developers. They're finishing the projects that were already on the books, but the new multifamily projects have slowed way down.
I would just say one of the things that I think is hopeful is that there's an enormous amount of innovation going on around construction technology, panelization, modularization, and there's a bunch of companies that have tried this and failed, and they're going back. But McKinsey did a study a few years ago that showed that over the last roughly 50 years, productivity in construction in the US has actually gone down. So just think about that. In the era of the invention of the computer, we have an industry where productivity has gone down. That's pretty remarkable. And so I think there is some hope. It's not going to solve the land problem, and that is the biggest problem by far nationally. But on the construction side, I think it will both deal with some of the cost issues, some of the labor issues, and the predictability issues that you can kind of warehouse things. But part of that also goes back to this regulatory issue, right? Is if you have every single jurisdiction in the country with a different set of codes, right? And literally you're going to close up the walls in the factory in 3 states away, and you're going to deliver those homes to 6 different states. Just think about the complexity of trying to understand how you build that. Now, we have manufactured home codes that HUD does that cover the country, but we don't have that in most building codes. So I think it's really important to be thinking about things like, could we get the International Building Code adopted more broadly, right? Are there ways to standardize that would allow some of these innovations that are happening in lots of other countries to come here? I was joking with Jonathan that one of the things I got very jealous about when I was HUD secretary, I'd visit with like my counterparts in other countries, and they'd be talking about, yeah, we're doing all this innovative climate stuff and we're doing zoning reform. And it's like, well, how do you do that? I said, well, we have our national building code. And I said, you've got a national building code? Oh my God, I'm totally jealous. I wish I had that. But that's a real challenge in terms of bringing costs down, at least on the hard costs on the construction side.
There are some exciting ones. Well, Tim, just quick note on that. We try not to be on the bleeding edge. We've done a few 3D printed houses on site. I'm not sure that's the answer. I've talked to some really smart people. I think 3D printing in factories, though, with panels could actually, I've been the sort of world's leading auto part 3D printer claims you can get about 70% of the material out by 3D printing just where you need structural support. So I think technology is coming, but this goes to policy and technology coming together, which is a huge deal.
So I got a really important question for you. Does that mean you'd send all your volunteers to the factory in the future? Like, how does that work?
Well, we think there's plenty of room. We've done modular. After Katrina, we did modular, and we did the stuff. The bottleneck were the electricians, drywallers, plumbers. So we did the stuff where you had scarce labor in the factory, and then the volunteers finished the last 20% after the on-site, the painting, landscaping, sort of more volunteer-friendly pieces, so you could still have the community piece of it. So I think they're creative hybrids. I'm not sure. We do have volunteers in cold weather places doing framing in the winter inside, but
imagine the safety briefing on those. Wow.
It is. We can work. There was a question over here. A couple questions.
Well, so do you guys see it being a new, I don't know, at the end of the issue, the finding land, and home ownership, and increasing the private equity economy that comes in, buying whole neighborhood, buying this home, they're buying dwellings, these acres of land, and what's your thoughts on that? That's definitely probably do us in the future.
Yes, the answer is yes, we do see it being a problem. And in fact, the proposal that's in the Housing Affordability Challenge that Sean mentioned from us is that we are going to intervene with a private partner and buy some of that inventory and preserve it for housing with lasting affordability ourselves. We have formed a new affiliate to intervene in that process. Now, we're just beginning. We don't have near the resources that private equity does, but we feel that if we can prove that that approach works, we can replicate it, we can attract additional investment and accomplish what we want.
Some new data would argue the private equity market now thinks the market's overvalued. So that money is disappearing really fast. But when we had zero interest rates, and it's a little targeted. Actually, Charlotte and Atlanta are two of the places where they would argue, oh, we only buy this much of the inventory. But if you get to suburban Charlotte and suburban Atlanta, they were buying 40% of the inventory. And that is hugely distortionary. And they were buying all the entry-level housing. So it really was creating a crunch for us.
Yeah. I would also just say, shout out to Chris and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, who did a great conference, what was it, last year? On the digitization of housing. And so part of the issue is private equity. Part of it is that we now have ways to value homes that you can live on the other side of the country and just go on Redfin or Zillow or whatever it is, get a valuation, and you're seeing many more players, much faster turnover where local, potential buyers are having a harder time as well. So even with private equity going out, I think there are larger policy issues, depending on where you stand on Airbnb and a whole set of other things. There's just a whole different way that the housing system works that's been kind of disadvantaging local buyers in ways that are important to think about beyond just the private equity piece.
Well, and just to piggyback that, it's shifted way more private credit, right? So it's private equity side of the thing, right? And now for private credit, when we get to that same environment with local developers, so obviously have a different, outcome in the home. But I think the elephant is what happens in 2024. We're all talking about the hope, but I think that there's obviously pressure on the legislation side, the legislative side. How do you actually see that play itself out? Because I think everyone in this room shares the same hope, but this room is not the country. And obviously the country is not necessarily having these dedicated conversations.
It's so complicated. I mean, sort of surprising bright spot to piggyback. I was on a train on the way to a big conference in January with the governor of Georgia. We sat together, and he is trying, not successfully yet, to do statewide removal of local authority to stop affordable housing. And you think, wow, that's an unconservative thing to do. But he's been incredibly successful at attracting clean energy companies to come and build their factories in Georgia. And the factories are now screaming because they can't hire workers. Well, they can't hire workers because there's no housing. So this is an economic imperative, not a moral imperative, though of course we think it's both.
Yeah, I will say that I think so, and maybe I'm being too optimistic on this one. So just similar to the Charlotte Executive Leadership Council, the CELC here, there's a version of that in every market that we all operate in. That's actually where you've got to play the ground game, because you have to actually get the change locally. It sounds like it's a great, I'd love for a national, but that's just not, it's not our system. So we've got to get at local jurisdiction and municipalities, the combination of corporate leadership at a local level, along with local governmental leadership, and that's where we're engaging in the dialogue consistently, because I actually think that's how you're going to affect the change, and it's a slog because it's market by market by market.
Well, it's even hyper-local, right? Because that mayor who needs to gain housing in that city is not necessarily in the same, the governor may have a similar thought process. And if you're not building affordability in 4 walls in the city, you're not keeping the employees there for the employer to stay.
Yeah, and then when I say local, I mean not state. Like, yeah.
But I do think, to go back to what I said earlier, and I'm going to be the last person here who's going to argue that the election in 2024 doesn't matter, and that the national leadership on this doesn't matter, and I don't want to, have this get partisan. What I would say, though, is that where I started, that the affordability challenges are much more everywhere now than they've ever been, is changing the conversation about this, right? And it's Georgia's trying to pass it. Florida just passed statewide legislation for overriding zoning, right? And requiring affordability. There are real conversations going on. I'll give you another example. We do a lot of work to try to sponsor the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act for the low-income housing tax credit. We have now well over half of Congress signed on, with an identical number of Democrats and Republicans signed on to that piece of legislation, including the acting Speaker of the House right now. So I think there really is change at the ground, and some strange bedfellow coalitions that are coming together around these supply issues. I think it is different on vouchers and a set of other things. But I think on these supply issues, there's hope around movement there.
We have run out of time, and we would love to keep the conversation going. Lightning round. First of all, a gigantic thank you. You are all unbelievable partners. Thank you for sharing your time today. Thank you for the work you're doing all year long on housing. So we can work back this way, but last thought, if you had your magic wand, one thing you would do that would unleash massive amounts of new housing?
One thing. No, it does come back to what we were just talking on the local level. I really think that that's going to be the key now. We've got to get every municipality's jurisdiction, we've got to be able to drive it at that level to be able to really unlock the housing availability issue. There's a lot of tools. The other thing is, what I would say is You heard a number of initiatives that are going on. I think that's really important. Sometimes we're looking for the silver bullet and we think it works everywhere. We didn't get to talk about the special purpose credit program. Tony had raised it, but a lot of us are participating. I was just in DC with Kleber and Secretary Fudge. But that's one in the toolkit, and all of these things have impact. Low-income housing tax credits, low down payment programs, down payments and closing cost assistance. And I think we've got to make sure that we lean in and we keep all of the arrows in our quiver working, because community by community, the issues are different. We just talked about the difference that you have in a place like California versus and communities across California. I know they're not all the same, versus here in North Carolina.
I would echo all of that that Steve said, and say that too, it really is investing with partners like Habitat who have clarity of mission, but also understand that we've got to deal with systemic root cause, because we've been band-aiding a lot of things, which has led to a lot of the complexities that we have to deal with that get in the way of our being able to be as flexible as we might want to be, just even on the capital side. But the work that Jonathan and team do in partnership with not only affiliates across the country, but around the world, to really think about systemic cause and how to get to the range of things that need to be addressed in the right order, but also in partnership. They've got to all move together at different speeds, but to keep the right pace going.
Seems simple. Just get every kid to go to a Habitat build early in their lives, and we'll build a movement for a right to housing in this country.
Ooh, it's not my idea. It's another organization called New America. They want to put infrastructure in place to track, measure, and produce what they're calling a housing loss rate, similar to the unemployment rate. What if every month you're bombarded with this number about how many people need housing in the country, and you get into specifics? How many is it in each market? It's not just compiled and put out periodically, but it's regularly available, similar to the unemployment rate. When those numbers come out, people start scrambling, things start to happen. Incentivizing folks, using that to build the movement, using that to educate the legislators who need to be motivated in order to come together and take some action. So I would say, it's that in combination with everything that everyone's talking about.
Great. Well, we are so grateful. Hopefully you feel like you got to sit down on a substantive conversation about a bunch of complex issues. I wish we had the magic, that silver bullet. I don't think it exists, but it is going to take hearts, heads, and wallets to make a difference. I want to thank our panel for your great partnership and your wisdom. Thank all of you for your time. We want to talk about beyond the build, because we need to build, and we've got to change hearts and minds so that we can actually move the needle at the policy level, really local, state, and federal. But I completely agree, Steve. Awful lot is going to be at the local level, and that's going to take people of goodwill saying yes and realizing. And we really believe Habitat, as I often say, is political but nonpartisan. We fight for good housing policy, but it can't be a red issue or a blue issue. And one of the strengths has always been we need to bring people together across
Jonathan, I was just going to say, if you weren't here at breakfast, you might not know, we talk about Laura like we talk about Madonna. She has no last name, but Laura Belcher, stand up. Laura is the president and CEO of Habitat here, and has put on an amazing event. And little known fact, Laura's never even been to a Carter Work project, and you would never know it based on what's happened here this week. So thank you. Everybody, if you don't know Laura, you ought to.